Flamio Hotmans, and welcome back to part 3 of reviewing the world building of the Avatar: The Last Airbender franchise. We talked so far about how to improve the world building of both the Water Tribes and the Earth Kingdom, and now it's time to dive into the hottest nation of them all, the Fire Nation. And before we continue, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel so that everyone can feel its sick burn. Alright, enough chit chat. Let's get right back into it, starting with volcanoes. As we saw with the other nations so far, each one of them lives in territories that can facilitate their bending, such as icy glaciers for the Water Tribes and vast terrains for the Earthbenders. And by that logic, it makes sense that the Fire Nation would be located near none other than freaking volcanoes. Talk about metal. Although if you think about it, while the concept is objectively cool and would definitely have its advantages, it would also cause some drawbacks. Granted, since they are firebenders, this means that said volcanoes can be further under control, as they can more easily help divert lava if needed. Hell, Sozin is shown to divert just the heat of volcanoes alone, and while we can't say he might have just been particularly gifted at this, it still means it's not out of the realm of possibilities. So, okay, if a volcano does erupt and there are enough firebenders around, they can keep it under control. Although, only if there are enough. Volcanoes are no joke, as they are incredibly powerful and hot, where even staying hundreds of feet close to magma can already burn you, and you would actually require specific suits to survive just its vicinity. And even if we didn't compare it to our real world, we're shown that even Roku, the freaking avatar of his time, had a hard time keeping a single one in check, even with the help of Sozin. Although, yeah, Kyoshi is a different issue. She's a particularly rare case of badassery. So yeah, great effort would be needed to keep these under control, but with that said, it's not impossible. So I think it's more than fair to say that after thousands of years and what must have been millions upon millions of firebenders, they were able to shape and control volcanoes and divert potential dangers and use them to their advantage. So much so, their capital and the palace of the Fire Lord is built inside the biggest one around. Talk about the ultimate power move. It's just possible that some smaller volcanoes might have been dormant, and since they're firebenders and not earthbenders, unless they get help from the Earth Kingdom, it's not inconceivable that eventually one or two of them might have escaped their radar before it was too late. So yeah, sorry Roku, but talk about bad luck. Anyway, if they overall have so much control over volcanoes, that could actually create some even further advantages. For example, they could just use those to create even more land. Like, let's take as a reference our real-world volcano of Eldfell in Iceland. In 1973, it erupted and obviously caused a lot of damage and tragedy, but at the same time, the sheer amount of lava flowing out ended up on the coast, close to the harbor, and when it cooled down upon contact with the water, it solidified and actually created more land all of a sudden, over 2 square kilometers. So at this point, the Fire Nation could have gone to some of these volcanoes, punctured some holes on the side, perhaps with asking the service of earthbenders, and used their firebending to divert the lava through specifically built canals, and make them land at sea and solidify and suddenly create a whole bunch of more, well, land. Volcanoes do have an extra advantage too, because ashfall does happen to be an excellent fertilizer, and the Fire Nation could grow crops after all, which is all well and good, until you realize there's some small hiccups with this. First off, if firebenders can create so much more landmass without even that much help from the earthbenders, how come their islands are so damn tight and small? Really think about it, we only ever see them in these small archipelagos, and even with wider shots of each island, there doesn't really seem to be that much more room for flat plains and whatever to grow agriculture. And this is taking into account that they can create landmass. So by proxy, if this is the best they could do in 10,000 years, it makes me think that the original islands were even smaller and this was the best they could do.
That's rough, buddy.
Yeah, no kidding, because that means that even if you do have ashfall, you literally don't have enough space to create the farmlands necessary to feed off the entire population. Not saying there wouldn't be at all, mind you, just that they would actually be more rare than you might think. And that's not even counting if you have the wrong ashfall. Cause, see, volcanoes emit two types of ashes, black and white. If it's black ashfall, sure, its properties are good enough to be fertilizer. But if it's white ashfall, that actually has corrosive and acidic elements in it. Which means that the crops there would actually end up being sick, damaged, or straight up die. And if it ends up in the diet of animals, it screws over their entire digestive tract, causes plenty of diarrhea, and it could even damage their teeth, and in turn it would screw over their digestive tract even more. It's just bad all around. And while firebenders can control the heat part of volcanoes, I'm not sure they'd be able to control the mineral and chemical parts of them, especially during what ends up being a very prolonged feudal era. Plus, lava bending wouldn't be invented until after the 100-Year War was over, and even then that will be an earthbender trait, not a firebender trait. Yeah, I know, we'll talk about that another time. Oh, and that's not even counting if a firebender accidentally, burns your crop. Granted, it is canonical that they can divert heat, and it's shown they could even snuff out fire if needed, which is definitely good, but one slip-up is all you need to screw over thousands of citizens for months. And also, hell, technically they don't even have any kind of advantage or resistance against fumes, as again, even Roku was easily knocked out by one accidental fume burst when he died at that volcano, and again, he's the freaking Avatar who could have just airbent it all away. Maybe they could have some slight protection and resistance, but clearly not enough if their own territory goes out of control. At which point, by the way, I have no idea if the Fire Nation would put heavy sanctions against any kind of smoking or incense or whatever because they can't afford to have more of it, or they get so used to it that they wouldn't even care anymore.
Winston, people are angry. They see us as the culprits.
Culpable for what? It's fog. Fog is fog. It comes and it goes away.
Perhaps I should remind him exactly how serious the situation has now become. Hospitals are filling up as our citizens are breathing in poisonous sulfur dioxide.
So, yeah, the Fire Nation is actually a lot more screwed than one might think, and they would have to rely on heavy trade just to be able to survive. If you really think about it, it's kinda no wonder that they're the nation that was so hell-bent on eventually wanting to conquer everything, if realistically speaking they would have to struggle to eat anything. Hell, even trees would have a hard time growing in, the Fire Nation, so they can't even exchange food for wood. So, at this point, what could the Fire Nation have of value that they could actually trade with the other nations? Well, actually, there could be a couple of things, and they would be salt. So, if you think that food was an issue for the Fire Nation, water would be doubly so, as they're the ones who are controlling the element that is the most opposite to water. Not to mention if they end up polluting their own waters from the ash of their own machinery when they start taking over in the 100-Year War. But while this wasn't specified in the actual show, so to be clear this is just my proposition, I think that the Fire Nation could have used this more to their advantage than they realize. They could have solved this trading and water issue with one simple method, and that is boiling seawater. Really think about it. Seawater is salty, meaning you can't drink it, much less use it for farming or whatever. But since they are firebenders, they can still create enormous tanks of metal. It's certainly a material that at this point earthbenders wouldn't be able to control yet, and the Fire Nation could find it and melt it with relative ease in their volcanic islands. Plus, no Avatar would have any reason to bother them about this, since it's something for the health of their own people and not for war, so it wouldn't have been a problem. Then, once these metal tanks are constructed, they can fill it with seawater and then boil it all. After which the evaporated water can go through a series of tubes, and they could recondense back into other containers as fresh, drinkable water. This way, they would at least have all the drinkable water that they want, and best of all, what's left from the previous tank is the thing they could trade with the other nations. Salt. Salt is an excellent spice for a variety of reasons, as it's not only a great ingredient for all sorts of food, something any nation would certainly want, but also because it functions as a great preservative for meat. So while the waterbenders could easily just use their own ice as perfect freezers, others like the Earth Kingdom, which I would argue have the greatest number of population if we're basing this off the size of the continent and the size of Ba Sing Se alone, would definitely need this for all its citizens and preserve all the food that they need. And at this point, even if the air nomads don't eat meat, they could still use it for their own vegetables or whatever. And while we're at it, if the firebenders can use metal this easily, I wouldn't be surprised if the Fire Nation would be hired for their craftsmanship in melting and sculpting metal, and glass at this point for good measure, and any other form of volcanic ore or whatever that even earthbenders would have issues with. So, yeah, overall they would have a hard time, but at least they would have a leverage with this. Not to mention they would easily be considered the makers of
the best red stuff over there. Fact.
Oh, and by the way, since there are some lightning benders, I think it's absolutely brilliant that they're used as an efficient workforce in Republic City during the era of Korra. No notes, I just think that that's great. Burns. Okay, this is going to be a bit of a heavier topic. We know that firebenders can control fire. Duh. They can control or redirect existing fire, snuff it out, and yes, they are the only ones who seem to be able to create their element out of nothing. Hear that, movie? But let's not forget, fire is freaking dangerous. One false move and you can permanently hurt anyone, even those closest to you. Jung really wasn't kidding when he said that fire is the most dangerous element that should be taken with the utmost seriousness and could even be considered a curse. He's very right, which makes me think burns will be very common for everyone. So, mind you, this will be a dark subject, but if we're to analyze how the world building of this nation would actually be like, I propose that across the entire Fire Nation, burns and scars would actually be not only common, but might have been implemented as an actual cultural custom, and at times they could even do it on purpose. Sort of like an airbender's tattoo, to symbolize that, yes, they are firebenders, and if they have to live in the constant danger of burning each other, they might as well do it beforehand, and at this point create them in elaborate drawings or designs or whatever, regardless of the shape, perhaps even as a rite of passage or something. Because if it has to happen anyway, they might as well do it on purpose and on their own terms. Now hold on, before you type away in the comments down below, I already know what you're thinking. If this were the case with everyone, then it would absolutely nullify the sheer weight of Zuko's scar, and we would rob the world of what ended up being quite possibly one of the greatest redemption arcs in fictional history. And you'd be right. So, while I do still think that it would be a cultural element anyway, I will forego that idea in order to preserve the good that we have. But we don't have to do so entirely. Since firebenders tend to shoot their fire from their feet or, most importantly, their hands, and they are the only benders who can create their own element out of nothing, this means that the hands, regardless of their position, will be the most exposed of the sheer heat of their fire. It wouldn't be as immediately dangerous since the full heat of fire tends to go closer towards the top or outermost edge of the flame, which by the way is how real-world fire eaters can accomplish their trick by snatching the flame from below where there's less heat, and thus firebenders would at least have a small protection there. But in the long run, it would still cause eventually some calluses and burns. So I propose that culturally, as soon as a firebender shows they have said ability, they have to go through sort of a rite of passage, where they would have to purposefully immerse their hands into fires or burning coals or whatever, slowly if possible, but eventually faster, until they have enough calluses or burns or whatever on their hands. They'd have to implement something to deal with the fact that they're firebenders, despite the issues that may come, such as not being able to feel anything with your hands anymore. Be it freshly cut grass, or soothing water, or your own lover. A necessary lesson to avoid going out of control later. But if nothing else, at least the face would be left intact, which means that it wouldn't alter or affect the story arc that Zuko goes through. A tough lesson, but let's face it, when you have the power of fire, awesome as it might be at first, it's definitely one that will inevitably force you to humble yourself one way or another. And if it doesn't, then you are a lost cause to begin with. The Sun Warriors. The Sun Warriors are a part of the Fire Nation that was thought to have died off completely, but instead are secretly alive and are the ones who help Aang and Zuko discover the true depths of firebending. They're the ones who are said to be the precursors to the modern-day Fire Nation, having learned firebending from the quote-unquote original firebending masters. In other words, fucking dragons! And now, ever since the Fire Nation has gone evil by starting the 100-Year War and twisting the true meaning and original source of firebending as an art form, the Sun Warriors keep themselves, as well as the last two dragons, Ran and Shaw, hidden from the world, since the Fire Nation has hunted almost all of them down. Now, cool as this all objectively is, there's a lot to unpack here. First and foremost, how the hell have they remained alive and in secret all this time? The temples, while certainly damaged and ruined, are still there. And if the Fire Nation is so hell-bent on conquering the world, why not just invade these lands and use them for, I don't know, military purposes or agricultural purposes or, I don't know, anything at all? It's not like the land isn't usable, as there's plenty of forests as well, so clearly plants can grow. And it's still Fire Nation land after all, so it's not like anyone would have stopped them. And there's so much of it that they could have used to just reconvert and create free real estate. True, perhaps the Sun Warriors served more religious purposes in the Fire Nation, and since they were deemed gone, perhaps just invading those territories would have given them too much of a haunted voodoo vibe, and firebenders would have been too superstitious at the idea of claiming it for themselves. Which, okay, could be fair, but remember, the Fire Nation by this point is going full gun-ho on invading the entire world. They don't care about religious purposes if it means halting their progress and conquest. And if they were so willing to, quote-unquote, wipe out all the Sun Warriors and hunt down all the remaining dragons, you know, the ones that were deemed to be the original freaking firebenders, and yeah, we'll eventually talk about that too, to the point that hunting down a dragon was considered achieving the highest title possible, I see absolutely no reason as to why getting rid of the Sun Warriors would have been A-okay, but getting their territories, which again, belong to the Fire Nation anyway already, would have been a big no-no. Second issue, even if they would have conquered said territory or not, how did the Fire Nation even know they were wiped out when clearly they weren't? And I don't mean, oh, how did they miss these guys specifically or whatever. No. What I mean is, how the hell did they not even find the bodies of potential Sun Warriors who might have been wiped out before? Like, we see the bodies of the Air Nomads and the Firebenders at the Southern Air Temple, and those were abandoned too. So if the Fire Nation didn't claim these territories and there were no bodies left around for any hypothetical battle, how did the Fire Nation come to the conclusion that the Sun Warriors were gone? There were no bodies as evidence. And no, you might think that, as Zuko told Aang,
the first people to learn from the dragons were the ancient Sun Warriors.
Sun Warriors? Well, I know they weren't around when I was a kid.
No, they died off thousands of years ago.
You'd be wrong, because it turns out, and this is canon, that was a propagandic lie created by the Fire Nation during the 100-Year War, so that everyone, including Zuko, believed they've been gone for thousands of years, when in reality they were out of the picture pretty much around the time the 100-Year War started in the first place. So how did they know at all that they were gone, regardless if there were survivors or not? And in the third and final part, what's the deal with saying that the dragons were actually the original firebenders, when in the Legend of Korra, this clearly ended up not being the case? So, yeah, as you can see, there's plenty of issues with these people. They're a really cool concept, don't get me wrong, but there's a lot of things that don't match. And in all honesty, there's so much of an issue that they kind of need a full rewrite. So, from here on out, this is my proposition on how their story and world building should be fixed. First, I would forego all the Indiana Jones style booby traps and whatever. Yeah, they're cool and all, but they feel very Saturday morning cartoonish. Which is the point, I get it. I love this kind of stuff too, but there are other approaches we can use here. Then, with that out of the way, I think there should be a different series of events with the timeline of their demise. Instead of having them being in general wiped out or whatever, since the Sun Warriors were the much more spiritually attuned people of the Fire Nation, and they canonically were already feeling that the Fire Nation was losing their way and replacing their inner source of fire with just hatred and rage, they perhaps foresaw that something was about to happen. And as soon as Sozin began the 100-Year War, they could have had some intel about what was about to happen and taken some precautions. It's not that impossible to think of after all, as even the Netflix live-action series starts with the plans of the invasion being stolen so that the Earth Kingdom could be aware of the attack, but it was all just a ruse from Sozin himself to trick them into diverting their attention away from the air nomads, leaving them more helpless. So, if the Sun Warriors would have been able to find out about the plan in advance, they'd know that even if the arrival of Sozin's comet would power them too, they would still be at a great disadvantage against the much greater forces of the rest of the nation who would have had superior numbers. They would have been doomed no matter what. And if the Sun Warriors knew this, they would have had only one solution left. To purposefully go into hiding and make everyone in the Fire Nation believe that they were dead. How, you may ask? By activating on purpose one of their nearby volcanoes with their firebending, especially since they could also be powered up by Sozin's comet when the war started, and could more easily accomplish this. And as we saw before, this can happen in general anyway with how one of them erupted and killed Roku just a few years prior, and so they figured that purposefully activating one would be a far greater challenge for the rest of the Fire Nation to overcome. Plus, Sozin's comet had only a very limited time span anyway, and as soon as that passed, they wouldn't have had that much power to stop or divert it anymore. Now, you might be thinking that activating a volcano nearby would spell certain doom for them. Yeah, whatever. Because they would then be buried under a mountain of soot. And you'd be right. So, I propose this. The Sun Warriors, with the prior knowledge of the invasion about to happen, could have secretly been in cahoots with perhaps a small section of Earthbenders and would have asked them to create a whole series of underground tunnels. Or hell, a full underground city for that matter. In exchange, the Sun Warriors would have given as much information about the Fire Nation as possible to the Earth Kingdom, so they could have been more prepared for their defenses. All of this in exchange to have a secret place to hide, while making the Earthbenders swear an oath to secrecy and make sure that everyone thought that the Sun Warriors were gone and cover up any suspicion. And by that point, the surface of their island would have been covered in so much soot from that purposeful exploding volcano that their city would have been completely buried. Kind of like a modern day Pompeii, where it would take probably even longer than a century for it to become a properly fertile land again, and if the Fire Nation tried any funny business in trying to take that territory again, the Sun Warriors could then add in as many booby traps as they pleased and pretend that they were the angered spirits of their own deceased ancestors, and then fuel their superstitions enough to leave the island alone. Or hell, maybe they were actual spirits for that matter, and they used the same method I proposed in the Southern Water Tribe in the first video of these series. Either way, Aang and Zuko then wouldn't have found an abandoned city anymore, but it should have been just a desolated, burned wasteland. But with that said, I know this causes another issue. How would the Sun Warriors have survived all this time? Surely if they lived underground, they couldn't have lived without water and food and, sunlight, since they're the freaking Sun Warriors. So, how can we fix that? Well, I think the solution is actually in the name. Sun Warriors. I propose that if they were indeed forced to go underground and remain in hiding this whole time, since their entire philosophy revolves around the positive aspects of the element of fire, the life-giving ones, out of sheer desperation, the Sun Warriors could have been forced to develop an entirely new technique that doesn't revolve just around creating a single flame, but the specific type of light that can create just enough radiation underground to mimic the sun. I don't mean full UV rays, by the way. Not that they'd know the scientific term for it anyway, but just enough to at least create photosynthetically active radiation, or PAR, which falls within the 400 to 700 nanometers on the light spectrum, the same with which we can see colors anyway, and facilitate the growth of plants with proper sunlight in these hypothetical underground areas. And if you think there's the potential that they could make some mistakes, or overdo it, or perhaps that spectrum isn't enough and they'll have to push even further and accidentally discover UV radiation, perhaps when they take turns into shining this new form of bending on the plants underground, they would necessarily have to wear plenty of extra heavy clothes to protect themselves against the very radiation that they're now emitting. In a way, they could look like underground sandbenders. I'm not saying this is a perfect solution, mind you, as this would still create some health problems along the way. Nonetheless, with this new technique, they could really earn their name as sun warriors and become the very first people to develop light bending. Also, as an extra little detail, perhaps they could culturally recycle all the soot that has covered all their temples on their island and make black the official color of their new traditions and cultures underground. Both for practical purposes, yes, but also for religious purposes as well. The black would become a new color symbolizing the mourning of how they lost their culture and their home, and also on how the Fire Nation lost its spiritual way and, in a way, spiritually died. So yeah, everything changed when the Fire Nation attacked even for them. Plus, the sheer black might help as a further contrast to focus on the life and light-giving aspects of fire and the sun. Also, there's a tactical reason as well. Because if black has become their new color, they might as well use it to disguise themselves against the soot wasteland of their island, and kind of pretend to be dark spirits that are haunting the place whenever the Fire Nation does arrive. And bonus point, could culturally become the inspiration that led Zuko to create the persona of the Blue Spirit. Actually, you know what? Scratch all of that. There actually is something like this already in the franchise. Because there are a group of women spirits in the Fire Nation called the Kirumikage that date back thousands of years to the very first Fire Lord. And they do haunt the nation at times as well as wear masks and dark robes. And while the context here is a little different, they are canon. So if they can exist, I see no reason why this proposition of mine couldn't work. Oh, and not to mention the further storytelling possibilities here. First off, because if firebenders do draw their powers from the sun as is canon, and the sun warriors are underground, then them being forced to rely only on their own inner fire can justify even more how they are the perfect teachers for Aang and especially Zuko to learn not to rely their bending on an external source, like the Fire Nation has with the comet, but to rely on their own inner path, their own instincts, their own pure inner flame. And then, finally, we have the issue of the f***ing dragons! Because, in all honesty, their origin completely clashes with what we then learn in The Legend of Korra. But this requires a much more in-depth discussion that we just don't have the time to explore right now. Also because next time we will be discussing what is possibly the most peculiar of the four nations, aka none other than the Air Nomads. So stay tuned for that video. Please join my Patreon to help support what I do here. Any amount will be massively appreciated, and I'll see you next time. Until then, keep building worlds.